All people that work in universities never speak to the title that they're given. So the title that I'm going to speak to actually today is What's Health Got to Do with It? And basically I want to try and persuade you that not only should social workers be interested in people's health, but actually social workers are a really kind of vital part, or should be a vital part, of ensuring and safeguarding the health of people with learning disabilities in ways that no other parts of our service systems do. I should warn you, as well as working at Lancaster, as part of that I work for a public health learning disabilities observatory, so that means that I have lots of graphs. So if you're into graphs, woohoo! If you're not into graphs, doze, wait for Mark. So when I talk about health, because I guess lots of health services kind of have this kind of implicit view of health as if you're not ill, then you're okay. But actually the World Health Organization takes a very different view of what health is. Can you hear me okay? I'm kind of a bit wobbly in and out. So the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now they're interesting words in themselves, looking back now to 1946. But basically it's not only about not being obviously ill, it's actually trying to achieve a state of wellness. And obviously I think as social workers, that is exactly where social workers should be, I think. And I'm not a social worker myself. So first of all, why does health matter? Well, first of all, as Hazel and Gavin have mentioned, we know that people with learning disabilities die a lot younger than other people. On average, something between 15 to 20 years younger. So this is from the Confidential Inquiry, which reported a few years ago, but we have other information from death certificates and other sorts of things, all finding this very consistent difference in age of death. So on average, people die 15 to 20 years younger. We also know that the life expectancy of people with learning disabilities is getting better, which is the lower line on that graph there. It's getting better, but the life expectancy of everyone else is getting better too. So the gap between the age of death of people with learning disabilities and other people is not really closing. If you take an even longer view, then it might be closing, but we're talking getting equal about kind of a century's time. I'd like it to be a bit quicker than that, personally. So we also know people dying much younger, and we know that many of these deaths, and more deaths for people with learning disabilities than other people, are avoidable. From the Confidential Inquiry. Sorry, shall I get a little lapel mic? Because if I turn around, I become not clear. So I'll just work out how to turn this on. The other thing, obviously, you know about academics is we have no practical skills whatsoever. No, I'm still getting a big fat nothing.
It is working.
Oh, is that what? So if I move away, yeah? So, sorry, no napping at the back anymore. We know that many deaths of people with learning disabilities are avoidable. So according to the Confidential Inquiry, 42% of deaths of people with learning disabilities were premature, which means that if health services and other services had done their jobs properly, those people would probably have lived for at least an extra year. We also know that pretty much half of all deaths of people with learning disabilities were deaths which could have been avoided, either if health and social care had done their jobs properly, or if they were supported, people were supported to live lives which were healthier lives. Confidential Inquiry talked about all sorts of problems which seemed to be linked, so they did quite kind of detailed analysis of why people had died. And they talked a lot about really common problems, about people's health problems not being picked up fast enough. And people sometimes not getting treatment, even though it was completely obvious that that was the treatment people should have. And healthcare and hospitals really not kind of doing things in ways that a person could access. So, for example, if you struggle in waiting in a waiting room for a long time because it's really stressful, having to wait in a waiting room for a long time is really stressful, and people may not get their treatment. If you're needle phobic, that's going to be a real problem. And so rather than kind of sorting out the needle phobia so people can then get tests they need, they were just left. And also, and this is a plug for the massage report, so there's a workshop this afternoon about it. You can't hear me. Some people count that a blessing. Is that any better? Is that any better? Let's go back to plan A. I'll just have to do that. So I'll turn this off. Is that okay? Oh no, I'm going to have to go all Frank Sinatra on you. Thank you. So, how many people recognise the person in the photo there? So many of you have heard of the Justice for LB campaign. That's great. Well, hopefully more of you will, and then we'll talk to other people about Justice for LB. So Connor Sparrow-Hawk was a young man who ended up in an assessment and treatment unit for all sorts of reasons, really around a complete lack of local community support. Connor had epilepsy. He was given medication in the unit which probably increased his chances of having seizures. The staff there didn't recognise that he was having more seizures, even though his mum was telling them that this was happening. And they allowed him to have long baths, unsupervised, and he drowned in the bath after having had a seizure. The Trust, Southern Health Trust, please go and find out about Justice for LB in terms of the blog and the hashtag. There's a long story there about how awful that trust had been. But one of the things that came out of that was a report by Mazars which looked at whether the trust were investigating unexpected deaths of people in their care. 1% of unexpected deaths of people with learning disabilities were investigated by the trust over a 4-year period. And we don't know what's happening in other trusts, although there are all sorts of efforts from University of Bristol, NHS England and CQC as well to find out more about that. But it seems that lots and lots of trusts aren't investigating deaths of people with learning disabilities when they should, because that's the way that they can learn what they're doing wrong to improve what they're doing later on. So we know that people die early. We know that people don't have to die early, but they do. We also know that people experience poorer health. So again, you know, I could bore you for days. We've got lots and lots of these kinds of graphs, but just some examples here. So this is from a big survey of 7-year-old children. And basically the health of children with learning disabilities is poorer than the health of other people in all sorts of ways. So parents are much more likely to rate their child's health as fair or poor. Many more children getting on for just over half of children with learning disabilities have 3 or more health problems. And even at the age of 7, children with learning disabilities are more likely to be obese than other children. Moving on to adults who are known to GPs. So adults who are known to GPs tend to be known to social care as well. There's lots of these basically showing that across the board, although there are 1 or 2 exceptions, that the rates of health problems experienced by adults with learning disabilities are higher than the rates of health problems experienced by other people. So in this case, asthma, epilepsy, type 2 diabetes, hypothyroidism, depression. The severe mental illness is quite an interesting one because that's about what GPs are recording. And given that we know that on any one day, 17% of adults with learning disabilities will be getting an antipsychotic, you wonder what that's about anyway. But there's also, and again, I think as social workers, presumably you'll be coming across lots of people, lots of adults who aren't in contact with learning disability services now, but they may have had a label of a learning disability as a child in education services. So this kind of hidden majority is about 700,000 adults with learning disabilities, well, who had that label as children in education services and who are now not known as such to any adult health or social care service. So there's a big group of people out there who aren't flagged as such and who are really struggling in terms of health as well. So here we can see this group of adults are much more likely to rate their own health as poor. And GHQ cases is a measure of kind of psychological distress. So adults with learning disabilities in this hidden majority group are much more likely to be reporting themselves to be in some kind of serious distress, really. We also know that people with learning disabilities have less healthy lifestyles on average. So again, survey with children, over half of children with learning disabilities never do any sport or exercise, compared to about 20% of other children. And for adults, about a quarter of adults had not walked for 10 minutes or more in the last 4 weeks, which for me is quite a shocking statistic. One of the things that comes up a lot, and we hear it still in some health services, this kind of idea which is more or less explicitly stated, that basically the poor health of people with learning disabilities is kind of inevitable. So we kind of expect people to die young because they're people with learning disabilities. Well, I think that's nonsense. A learning disability is not in itself a health condition. It is not a diagnosis. It's a statement of something about people's capacity to learn, and that's all it is. We know that some people are at greater risk for some health issues. So for people with Down syndrome, for example, we know children with Down syndrome are more likely to have congenital heart problems and more likely to have hypothyroidism. And they're also more likely to have early onset dementia. Dementia's only come up as an issue recently because the healthcare of children with Down syndrome has improved. So 30, 40 years ago, children with Down syndrome wouldn't be getting the heart operations which they need. They wouldn't have been investigated for hypothyroidism. That's really quite a straightforward thing to treat. So the kind of medical textbooks of 40 years ago would say people with Down syndrome, they're kind of likely not to make it beyond kind of early adulthood. But if you improve healthcare, people's life expectancy of Down syndrome has shot up. We also know that people with a greater degree of learning disabilities have more issues around epilepsy, incontinence, dysphagia, which is trouble kind of swallowing. But again, if you know those things and you're committed to do something about them, you can really make a big difference to a person's life, and you can really reduce the chances of them dying early of things related to those issues. And for me, if you assume that poor health is inevitable, an early death, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you don't look for ways in which you can support people in their health. You don't look for ways in which you can try and extend people's lives. You don't think too much about really making that kind of the kind of effort which you make for anyone else in terms of a person's health. Is poor health about poor health services? Well, partly it absolutely is. So we know that for people with learning disabilities, they have lower usage of routine and preventive health services. So things like cancer screening, for example. People with learning disabilities are less likely to get various forms of cancer screening than other people. In terms of annual health checks, we know around half of eligible adults with learning disabilities get those health checks, despite GPs being incentivised financially to do them. But also, we know that there are some examples of kind of higher usage of health services, which are an example of the failure of proper health services to support people. So people with learning disabilities are more likely to turn up in emergency services in hospitals, often for things which actually, if people are being supported properly, they should never be in A&E in the first place. Constipation, for example, is a really big issue for people and can kill people. And we know, I mean, Connor is kind of one person who this happened to, but we know there are many more. And these stories about people are still coming out time and time again. Cases where basically health services really have not, and these are kind of mainstream health services as well, so kind of general hospital services, that they really haven't tried to adjust what they're doing so that a person with learning disabilities can access that health service. And there are various kind of catastrophic examples coming up time and again. As I mentioned, there's also very high usage of antipsychotics and antidepressants, and there's very high rates of polypharmacy, which is a fancy way of saying many drugs, and not the fun ones either. So this is just an example of breast screening. You can see that women with learning disabilities, who are the kind of lilac bars, are about 10% less likely to access cancer screening than women without of the same age. And this is from data that's covers about half of all people in England. In terms of use of health services, we see for children are much more likely to have been to hospital. Children with learning disabilities much more likely to have been to hospital than other people. And again, this is this kind of hidden majority group who you might think would be healthier than some other groups. About a third of adults with learning disabilities are on 5 or more different medications, which sounds like a lot in my book. So for me, people with learning disabilities have poorer health. For me, that is not inevitable. It is not a part of people's condition at all. If there are issues associated, you can do something about them. Health services make a difference, but there's a whole world about people's health that is beyond health services. And this, to me, is where social workers can really come in and really play an important part. So this is the rainbow of health inequities. In the public health world, this is quite kind of famous thing you'll find a lot. It's really about kind of global inequities in health. And when I talk about inequity, there's this quote here. It's differences in health status between groups which are unnecessary and avoidable, but in addition are considered unfair and unjust. What I think, I mean, to be fair to NHS England, I think NHS England would absolutely apply that statement to people with learning disabilities. But we need all services to take that on. The differences we see in health are unnecessary. They don't need to happen. They're avoidable. We know how to make them not happen. We need to get everybody to realise that those differences are unfair and unjust. And just one thing about this rainbow, I guess you can't really see that clearly, but healthcare services is a little green bit over there. The things that really matter in terms of people's health beyond health services are massive. Individual lifestyle factors, social and community networks, all the things that kind of social workers are really involved in. Housing, education, work, neighbourhoods, all those kinds of issues are really crucial. And I think social workers have a real part to play there. So just to sum up, children and adults with learning disabilities, we know they're more likely to be living in poverty and hardship. And again, there are lots of kind of consistent research around this. More likely to be living in inadequate housing, cold, damp housing. We know that they're more likely to experience a whole range of adverse life events. We know that children and adults are more like, well, not children. Children are more likely to be unemployed. Let's not go chimney sweep. Let's not go down that Victorian route. Adults are more likely to be unemployed, much more likely to be unemployed. People are restricted in their social networks. And we know that people with learning disabilities experience discrimination and violence as a fairly routine part of people's lives. And all these factors are really important in accounting for the differences we find in health between people with learning disabilities and other people. So if we can work on these things, which again are all things which social workers I think should be interested in, then that's going to have a massive impact on people's health. So again, more data. On the left, we have the employment rate of working age adults with learning disabilities, working age adults in England. So just over 70% of adults in England were employed at the time. The figure for working age adults with learning disabilities known to social services is 6%. So the government has a policy of halving the employment gap. Let's get on with that one, shall we? We know that adults with learning disabilities are less likely to be involved in all the kind of civic and social participation things. So things like being a member of any kind of club, society, organisation, political party. Again, they're much less likely to be involved in those. That's people with the purple bars. We know that fewer people say it's easy to visit family. Fewer people say they have 2 or more close friends. Fewer people go out socially. In terms of exposure to violence, children, so there's a big survey called the Millennium Cohort study where we've managed to identify kind of a group of children with learning disabilities to compare to other children. 14% of children with learning disabilities say they've been bullied more than once or twice at school, compared to 6% of other children. And in terms of adults, 13% of adults with learning disabilities say they've been threatened with or actually experienced actual violence against them, compared to something like 6% of other people. So people with learning disabilities as a group, and obviously there's kind of huge variation, huge number of people, have a tougher time. And that tougher time that they're having is going to have a massive impact on their health. So, why should social workers care? Well, I think, how can you not care as social workers about people's health? We know that people are dying prematurely. We know that people are in needlessly poor health. They're living their lives in multiple adversity. They're often living in service systems that make things worse rather than better. And that's social care as well as healthcare. And many people aren't getting any support at all. And for me, whatever you're doing or not doing as a social worker is going to have an impact on a person's health, whether you plan for that or not. So it's really important, I think, that social workers really kind of stake that claim to health. Does it mean you have to be health workers? And particularly with all the kind of integration of health and social care chat that's around, I think absolutely not. And if anything, the opposite is the case. Social workers can be part of a system that makes things work. You can be a good kind of functionary in the system, but that's actually not really working on the adversities that people experience in their health. Or social workers can be the one profession in the system whose job it is to have the person's back, to be kind of on the side of the person and with them with all this stuff. And I think the focus on, if you're talking about kind of health inequities and all the kind of social systems that underpin that, I think health services generally aren't really very good at thinking about those things. And I think social workers absolutely need to be an independent voice to healthcare systems to point out those things. So I really would not want to see social work absorbed as kind of an outpost and part of health. I think an interest in health and a focus on health in a very distinct way is really important for social work. And social workers can reach the parts that health services don't. So what can social workers do? Well, human rights. Social workers should be the upholders of human rights. And again, that's kind of an important theme of this conference and previous health, but there's also lots of stuff about the social conditions that underpin health. Employment, voting, transport, housing, all those kinds of things. And for me, there is no health without human rights. If you're not able to exercise your human rights and you're stopped from doing that, you can't, there's no health without those things. What kind of things might you do, social workers? Uphold the Mental Capacity Act. We're currently analysing some CQC inspection reports of mainstream hospitals, looking for where they mention people with learning disabilities, but we've also included where they mention the MCA, because it's a really big issue, and many hospitals are not good at all at knowing it exists and then understanding what to do with it. And I think that kind of Mental Capacity Act actually is a really important thing that social workers can bring. I think social workers can challenge what are called protective social care practices, so this idea of a risk is you going out and having fun and doing anything. Actually, in public health terms, that is the most risky thing you could do. It is no protection to leave somebody sat at home all day doing nothing. In terms of their kind of long-term health risks, that's a really, really bad thing to be doing. So when we think about risk of doing something, we need to balance that with the risks of actually not doing anything. Very few people with learning disabilities die of having too much fun. That is not what people die of. People die of the consequences of a long-term, unequal life. We need to challenge service narratives of choice to justify unhealthy lifestyles. Yes, of course, that person really wants to, sit in front of the telly and never go out and eat 20 bars of chocolate. And the person might be there saying, actually, I'd like to go swimming. And the social care is saying, what? So there's this whole kind of use of choice to justify unhealthy lifestyles, where it's never used to justify prioritising healthy lifestyles, fun things which people might want to do. And again, I'm thinking of Mark and Stephen and his discos. You know, they must be exhausting, those discos. And in terms of kind of physical activity, being healthy, what a fantastic thing to do. But again, in a residential care home, will they support that? I don't think they would. We need to challenge services to encourage more healthy life choices. Social workers need to challenge service attempts to bounce people into restrictive services, so the kind of inpatient units and other units. So things like, for example, many examples of what are often seen as challenging behaviour might be actually expressions of physical pain because of some underlying physical health condition, for example. And social workers can be there saying, well, have you made sure those things are checked out before you leap to a challenging behaviour conclusion? And I think social workers have a really important role in supporting people to access the right health services for them at the right times in ways that work for people. So if somebody isn't attending their annual health check because social care staff are saying, we haven't got the shifts, we haven't got the people to support, you know, someone to go, well, as a social worker, you should be there kind of fighting on the person's side to make sure that they can exercise their right to attend that health check. What else can social workers do? Promote self-determination. For me, that is absolutely not the same as choice. So choice is you choose from what options are laid out for you. Self-determination is about control. So you have control over what those choices are, but also I think you have control over whether and when you have choices. So I don't always want to have to make the choice of what I want for tea. Maybe sometimes I'd like somebody to say, oh, well, I'll cook for you. And they'll kind of know, roughly the range of what I like. Sometimes I'll absolutely want to cook tea, and I do most of that anyway. And I do the shopping, so I have control over what's in the fridge. That's the most important thing. But anyway, but also control is sometimes you might want to say, you make that choice for me now, but I always have the control over taking that back. So we need to think about control rather than choice. And also we need to encourage people to develop what they need to be able to exercise that control. So it's interesting, there's a project in Sheffield that's working on a weight loss programme, so adjusting a particular kind of weight loss programme so people with learning disabilities can go and attend with other people. And a lot of people's reluctance, some people are saying, well, actually, I don't want to go on my own. I'm quite worried about being out after dark. I'm worried that the other people in the group will laugh at me or not accept me. Transport's difficult. All those kinds of things. And that's because of, people's histories have gotten to a point where that's where they are. And I think a really important role for social work in terms of health is helping people to get to a point where they're kind of confident and wanting to take those choices. And we need to encourage others to support the person in their exercise of control. So last slide, I think this is pretty much. Also, social workers are the ones who really should be concerned with the adversity of people's life circumstances. Talk about kind of the impact of austerity. We talk about money. We can talk about housing. We can talk about employment. All those things. We can talk about friendships. We can talk about having a meaning to your life. All those things, I think, where social workers have a place, where actually, I don't think, particularly in health, they don't really have that focus, because no one person can have a focus on absolutely everything. So people in health have their focus, but I think social workers absolutely have their focus here, and helping people in circumstances of adversity is going to be really important for people's health. So hopefully I've managed to sketch out, I guess, an argument which is why social workers should be interested in the health of people with learning disabilities, why I think health needs social workers to be social workers to help support people in their health, and some ideas for what social workers might do. As I mentioned, I'm part of a Learning Disabilities Observatory, which now is IHAL, but we're now FELDO, which has some strange word associations for me, which I won't go into. So anyway, we exist until at least March next year. Beyond that, who knows, but we're here until March. The personal blog where there's lots of graphs and ranty things. And if you want to email me or I'm on Twitter there, that's how to contact me. Thank you very much.